So when we see things like this happen over and over and over again, we see nothing in the way of consequences. You start to like understand, okay, maybe the process that is supposed to engage in review and analysis or audits of the death isn't on the up and up.
Welcome back, everybody. This is Jim Budd, former senior patrol agent with the United States Border Patrol. I did want to do a quick note and just state that I'm thinking about changing the name to Borderland Talks with Jim Budd, just because I want to talk about other things other than the Border Patrol. And today's a good example of that. Today I have with me Andrew Free, who has a wonderful last name. He's an attorney who graduated from Vanderbilt University Law School in 2010, one of my favorite schools. Andrew has been documenting deaths in DHS custody for Detention Kills. He is, like I said, an attorney. He's counseled for more than 100,000 current formerly detained immigrants working for their challenging and working and involuntary work and unjust pay in the facilities that are run by ICE or facilities that are run by with ICE contracts, subcontracts. Welcome to the podcast, Andrew. How are you doing?
Thanks, Jen. I'm doing great. And part of the reason I'm doing great is because I'm no longer practicing law. I am a lawyer, not
Yes.
an attorney anymore. I stopped practicing in 2022. I taught law school for a year out at University of Washington, and now I'm working as a journalist and organizer. So I think that I have to attribute a lot of how I'm doing to that. But everything else.
No doubt, no doubt. Is this a long-standing thing that you are you drawn to it just because of the tragedies that you saw, kind of like me, and like, I have to do something about this, and you just completely change your gears and start doing something else? Is that how this started? I mean, because you're very specific about the date, May 15th, 2017. Why that day?
Yeah, that was the day that Gene Jimenez died at the Stewart Detention Center in Lumpkin, Georgia. And a day or two later, a colleague of mine, and another immigration lawyer colleague, who's paralegal, so Andrea Martinez in Kansas City, was had a paralegal named Karina, whose brother is Gene. So her paralegal died, or her paralegal's brother died in custody, and somebody just reached out knowing that I had spent a lot of time suing ICE agents and litigating against private immigration detention contractors, and asked if I would look at this. And I had been marginally involved in one other in custody death case kind of at the beginning of my legal career. He was a man who died organ by organ in a jail in Tennessee. And the guy I worked for, Elliot Osment, had been kind of retained, with the help of the Mexican consulate, actually, to investigate his death. And so I sort of came in on the tail end of that one, but I had always stayed away from that sort of case. And, I did not come into that representation of Gene's family as an abolitionist, as a
Mm-hmm.
person that reform is counterproductive. I had all sorts of views about the system that Gene's death and then the subsequent cases that I worked kind of taught me were not the way it actually works. And over the course of the past coming up on 7 years, the records work that we've done through Freedom of Information Act and state records request, and the accountability litigation work that we've done, um, trying to seek some semblance of closure for a lot of these families, has taught me about the true nature of the system, through what it does in material terms, as opposed to what it says it does in the wake of one of these deaths. So yeah, I am not a person who got into this work thinking that I was going to be um, constantly delegitimizing and questioning the narratives.
Let me ask you this, because Border Patrol has deaths in custody, and I know you're aware of the critical incident teams that I brought forward, and how they were cover-up teams. And I think the most recent one I talked about was a man, an American man who, pulled up to our checkpoint at I-8, the one I used to work here in San Diego, and had a little bit of weed on him. And they said he had some meth residue in his car. And so they held him to charge him. And then at some point they said, he just died in custody. And they claimed that he had somehow ingested, like, I think they said 150 milligrams of meth. And so he suddenly just up and died. Um, the thing about it that gets me the most is I think for a long time, and these teams, they've been moved into CBP and they're still doing what they're doing. That nothing's changed. They just have a different color shirt on. And they're actually adding to them. They're training. I found the other day. Unfortunately, the NGOs involved in it don't seem to really care. And I thought to myself, like, if this is going on in Border Patrol, that happened, that started in the 80s. We started those groups. It surely probably is happening in ICE because I know that Border Patrol, when after 9/11, Border Patrol had huge amount of influence on how CBP was developed and how ICE was developed. And ICE is almost seen like a continuation of Border Patrol. So you see a lot of Border Patrol, and the cultures are very similar. CBP does have more of an ability to claim professionalism in some manners, at least when you get them off the field. There you have scientists, they have all sorts of stuff, important trade people that are working on things and so forth. But ICE and Border Patrol are very much the same in their enforcement and their brutality. And so I thought, what are the chances? What are the chances that ICE may have covered up deaths in custody and things like that? Is that what you're finding? Is you're finding like absolutely no accountability, like in the Border Patrol, 100 years of Border Patrol agents, and not a single one has been convicted of ever killing a migrant on duty in 100 years. And that's just ridiculous. That's just implausible statistically. So, and of course we know about the teams. Do you think that same kind of we can do no wrong and we're going to do whatever we can to cover up and we're just going to do it and make ourselves look good and nobody cares about us because the people that we're doing this to are mostly migrants? But in the situation that I was talking to you about in first, that was an American guy. It was a white man. And he didn't even get an investigation. They let the critical incident teams, I have literally the sheriff saying, we're going to let the critical incident team do the homicide investigation. The man has never received an actual investigation. Is this what you find in ICE? Is it similar?
Well, I assume by investigation you mean like an actual criminal investigation that involves forensics, that involves the taking of testimony from witnesses, potentially collecting evidence, preserving it so that if there is potentially evidence of a, criminal wrongdoing, that you would have a chain of custody that would allow further prosecution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what I mean.
Yeah. So the short answer is the same phenomenon applies in ICE custody. It's a little bit different because with critical incident teams, there are people, my understanding of all of your work and the work of others who helped expose and, you know, at least shut down that particular formation of this phenomenon, this larger impunity machine. People showed up, right, to like make sure that actual law enforcement investigators didn't get involved. We were really spoiled in Gene's case because the criminal investigators actually did show up when he died. Because in Georgia, I used to believe, I now no longer think this is true, but in Georgia, when you die in custody, there's supposed to be a Georgia Bureau of Investigation inquiry. And that inquiry does not proceed from the premise that no crime has been committed, because a lot of people die as a result of things that could be prosecutable in custody. And
Mm-hmm.
so, a GBI agent, a couple of GBI agents came in the middle of the night, and they began cordoning off the scene, collecting evidence, beginning the process of an autopsy, and interviewing witnesses about what happened. And because of that, we were able to see what one of these investigations looks like when non DHS criminal investigators get involved. And like I said, that spoiled me because I was thinking that that's what normally happens. And what the investigation showed um, was that a core civic guard falsified the logs um, to make it seem as though he had checked on Gene when he had not. And the video demonstrated that. And so he immediately, under questioning, admitted to falsifying the logs and said, the reason I falsified the logs is because I was working the end of a double and there were only two other people for the entire solitary confinement unit. And one of them was on one-to-one observation and the other one was taking a person to the shower who had scabies or something like that. So like it was just physically impossible to do all the work.
Hmm.
And the GBI investigators finished their investigation and ICE like said that they couldn't give us anything or they couldn't start their OIG investigation and records later bore this out until the GBI finished. So I was like, oh, okay, so there's actually something that goes on here. As a result of that investigation, based on basically on the GBI, the Office of Inspector General actually recommended one of the guards for criminal prosecution for making false statements,
Wow.
which is,
That's unusual.
I didn't realize at the time how exceptional that is when it comes to
Hmm.
the incidents. It's the only case I'm aware of, at least since 2017, and I think before, in which there's been a recommendation by DHS for criminal prosecution as a result of violations involving an ICE death in custody.
Hmm.
Um, but the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Middle District of Georgia declined. And after 6 years of FOIA litigation and at least 5 or 6 different FOIA requests to various agencies, we still have not gotten the declination memo. That is the decision by the U.S. Attorney's Office for why we're not going to prosecute, which is a thing that
Hmm.
people get in other cases. And so, like I said, I got spoiled into thinking that there would be this body of evidence that's collected by people who are outside of the system, and then that body of evidence would form the basis of a determination about what happened. And in doing case after case of this, I concluded that is not true. Um, Instead, what happens is, and in fact, we tried to use Georgia as a model for the state of California. The California legislature passed a bill that said when people die in custody, particularly civil custody, like ICE detention,
Hmm.
the California DOJ is going to come in and do an independent death investigation because why
That's
would you want
that would
to
be
not
better.
investigate deaths in custody? At the time, I think 5 people had died at Adelanto in
Hmm.
um, and Gavin Newsom vetoed the bill at the behest of the sheriff's lobby because if people start dying in the sheriff's custody and independent investigations come in, then you might find the things that we find in case after case, which is falsification of records,
Hmm.
which equates to contract fraud. If you're saying you're doing all these 24/7 checks and you're not doing them,
Yeah.
then you've got problems. And then also destruction of evidence. So in multiple cases, we've discovered through FOIA and through other means that the contractors, so whether it's LaSalle Corrections in one case or Core Civic in another case or Geo in a third case, we've just discovered that evidence has not been preserved, which, if there were an actual criminal investigation going, destroying the video that is at the center of the criminal investigation would be a real problem. It'd be, you know, evidence tampering, obstruction of justice. I mean, you can see in other contexts people getting charged for this stuff. And setting aside the criminal investigation, these are federal records that are covered under contract and the Federal Records Act. And
Hmm.
destroying things under the Federal Records Act without telling the National Archives and Records Administration is itself a separate crime.
Yes.
And
Yes. And
the head of
lying
the
on government forms is also a separate crime.
so when we see things like this happen over and over and over again, we see nothing in the way of consequences. You start to like understand, okay, maybe the process that is supposed to engage in review and analysis or audits of the death isn't on the up and up.
My first question in that little bit that you said is, well, who's doing the destroying, Andrew? So, like in Border Patrol, obviously the people involved in the scene, the first responders or the people who caused the incident, maybe Border Patrol agents, they're on the scene. And in a lot of instances, we are in the middle of nowhere. So it's kind of to your advantage. And even in cases, though, like the Anastasio Hernandez Rojas killing down here in 2010, where they tased the man over and over until he died and just beat him in this horrible Rodney King sort of death, and they all got away with it. In that instance, they got away with it because of the critical incident teams who then came in and did the destruction of the actual evidence. Are the ICE agents who come upon this scene, are they destroying evidence, or are investigators coming in that are supposed to be like ICE OPR or somebody coming in? Are they the ones destroying it?
So it varies case by case.
Okay.
In and a lot of it is at the contractor level. So below the level of
Oh,
federal employee. Um,
well, that's
and some of
convenient.
it, yeah, isn't it? So, I'll do a couple of examples, right? Ronald Francisco Romero's case, who died at Port Isabel in May of 2018. He was in Ursula, which is the McAllen Border Processing Center, at the same time that family separation was popping. It was like a week or so before, you know, Merkley and the press and everybody was were being toured through that kind of internal chain link. You've seen the images and you can look it up. But he was on the floor of one of those places in incredible pain because he was dying of bacterial meningitis, which is a condition that expands and swells your brain. And so people don't typically die of it because they go to the emergency department because it's so your headache and the pain is so excruciating.
Yeah.
When he gets to Port Isabel, instead of being released to a hospital, not only do they put his medicine, the antibiotics they'd given him in his property instead of like giving them to the medical providers, they do this group screening of people who get in. And when they're asking, is anybody in pain, he raises his hand. Um, but the people at this federally owned facility, the Port Isabel Detention Center, which is run by a contractor, but it's owned by the feds. I've been writing about Port Isabel and its history. They used to call it El Corrallon, like the corral or the wasteland, or depending on how you want to translate it. They
Mm-hmm.
destroyed the notes from that initial processing. I mean, just destroying medical records is like not a thing that you
Mm-hmm.
anticipate, is supposed to happen. And initially they said he died of complications involving diabetes mellitus or something like that. And then we said, well, we're going to send in an autopsy. And I sent the forensic pathologist there. And they said, oh, no, we got to do an autopsy. It's like, okay, well. So our forensic pathologist had to leave and go back. And anyway,
So
um,
they hadn't even done an autopsy, you're
they
saying?
told me that they did a visual autopsy. And the reason that the
Ah,
person, the visual, make sure. And he basically said, we have so many bodies washing up here that if we autopsied all of them, that's all we'd be doing. That's what the local law enforcement officer told me.
yeah, so I mean, isn't that
That
your
should be
job?
yeah, I mean, that
Why
should
don't
be
you ask the feds for more money if you're doing too many fed autopsies, then,
or, or
instead of
perhaps
just not
create
doing them?
perhaps create the conditions where people don't die as often. So
Well,
that's one,
that's a good idea too.
you know, um, you're spending a lot of money. The money's there.
Hmm.
Just is it
Yeah,
preserving or taking life?
right.
Another case, we found there was an autopsy done, and that autopsy concluded that Gergen Miramanian, who died in April of 2018, a month before Ronald, also in Texas, in the Prairie Land detention facility outside Dallas and Alvarado, that was owned by LaSalle Corrections, is owned by LaSalle Corrections. The autopsy by American Forensics showed that he had a psychotropic drug in his system that he had not been prescribed. ICE doesn't even admit that this drug is in his system in their final report. Their mortality review finds that he got fine care. But what we found was evidence was destroyed, video missing, and his commissary records were destroyed. Which hypothetically, if you were trading, some sort of money or purchases for the antidepressant, that would
Hmm.
be relevant, right? Like that would help you
Right.
determine whether a guard had sold you the drugs, or a nurse
Mhm.
had sold you the drugs. And this is we wrote about this in Prism. We wrote to the National Archives and Records Administration about the destruction of the video, and you can read about it. The guards were found grossly negligent, or they had dereliction of duty because they were falsifying the logs.
Mhm.
It's the same
Mhm.
thing that happened the year before with Gene's case,
Mhm.
and OIG recommended prosecution. But in Gergen's case, by the time ICE got there, the reviewers, the death reviewers, by the time they got there in like May, the guards hadn't even been punished yet. you know. A third case was Roxana Hernandez, who died after being shipped from multiple facilities out of the Otay Mesa port of entry, and then Otay Mesa Detention Center, taken to the hospital in California in Chula Vista, not cleared for detention according to the records because of untreated HIV. And
Mhm.
then somebody said, okay, she's going to get care, and then shipped across several states, finally at Cibola, and then in Albuquerque. The video from Roxana's time at the Core Civic Cibola facility is gone. And the National Archives and Records Administration has asked ICE for an explanation of why that video is gone. As it turns out, the independent forensic pathologist who did the autopsy of Roxana, the person ICE attacked after the news came out of what it showed, he found that because he did a subcutaneous dissection, he dissected what you do in a death in custody is you look to see if a person was bruised or harmed in ways
Mhm.
that don't maybe show on a visual autopsy.
Mhm.
And he found that, yeah, there were handcuff bruises. There were
Mhm.
these bruises that were consistent with being beaten with a baton while you had your hands behind your back because there were no defensive wounds.
Mhm.
ICE denied this. The forensic pathologist they paid denied it and attacked the pathologist. Um, Sent stuff on background to reporters about how eh,
Mhm.
but nobody ever asked for the photos from the autopsy.
Mhm.
Nobody ever asked to see what he was relying on. And it strikes me like they did not care. And
Mhm.
then the video's gone. There's a number of other instances, but one that's like really sticks out to me is the last one that ICE posted on their website, the last detainee death review that ICE posted on their website voluntarily before this one at Torrance.
Mhm.
Um, and that was Roger Racin, who died in Louisiana in 2017 in a geo facility. The injuries that he had were such that the coroner and the forensic pathologist could not rule out homicide as a cause of death. So if you ask how many homicides have occurred in ICE detention, ICE can't tell you, right? Like the number should be zero, I think we could agree. But the nature of the forensics is such that, and the nature of the investigation is such that we don't know, you know. I wish these were the only records that showed this, but unfortunately they are not. And so who's destroying the records? A lot of times it's the contractors, I think it's the process of saying,
Mhm.
okay, we're going to send a form letter with a bunch of boxes that you're supposed to check. We're going to have the assistant field office director who's in charge of the facility and only that facility. We're going to have that person send it to the warden and let you gather all your documents and get your ducks in a row. In Gene's case, the authorities at the facility who work for the private prison had a conversation with the guard, and he actually filled out multiple statements about Gene's death, one before the conversation and then one after. you know, that's not what you would expect if you were trying to get to the bottom of what happens. It's not what I would expect, at least. Maybe other people have different thoughts, but so it's
Well,
more of
that's
a
what ICE expects. That's what they want, you know, that they designed the system.
yeah, and it's designed. I mean, so to your question, like about the zero border patrol agents have ever been convicted in the killing of a migrant, right? In the 100-year
Mhm.
history, zero facilities that I'm aware of have ever been have ever lost a contract or failed an inspection because of a death in custody. In fact, inspectors don't even acknowledge the deaths that happened, sometimes multiple deaths, in their inspection reports. So, why would you be incentivized if you're a private business not to take
Who
somebody's life?
who's doing the inspections though?
So that's a good
That's the
question.
question.
I love
Because
that
I mean, as
question.
far as I know, there's no inspections of Border Patrol detention facility, or essentially they're processing facilities or
Yeah.
holding centers. But I have never seen, and agents today tell me, nobody inspects us. Nobody comes in here. We can do whatever we want in here, and whatever they say we're doing in here, nobody's going to believe them, and we won't have the records or video. And every single time that's like they said that in the Anastasio case. Oh, there's no video. There's video. They said that in Sergio Adrian's case. Oh, there's no video. There's video. They always say that. They always just flat out lie.
In a couple of Border Patrol deaths that we worked involving children, the inspector general, so who's inspecting the facilities? One would think that the inspector general would inspect them if there are complaints. I've seen some of those, maybe. There are these joint intake center reports that sometimes are
Yeah.
filed where people go in and, there's, I think that perhaps there are some mechanisms in the government right now where people are actually getting money to inspect these places. I know Border Patrol, or excuse me, OIG got a bunch of money to bring medical experts to various detention locations. And I was just looking on the Office of the Immigration Detention Ombudsperson's website, and there was a U.S. Border Patrol facilities Big Bend sector inspection in 2023. I mean, one of the radicalizing moments for me on this issue, and particularly in the Border Patrol context, was the El Paso OIG inspection, where they
Mm-hmm.
went announced in 2018, and they found something like 50 plus people in a room designed for eight, you know,
Mm-hmm.
um, and they found that some of those people hadn't been let out of that room for like a week.
Mm-hmm.
It's a 72-hour facility,
Mm-hmm.
and so there are some inspections, but then what
Aren't they
happens?
usually notified ahead of time, though? A lot of times they're notified ahead of time, and then a lot of times the inspectors are former Border Patrol agents who, the way it works in the Border Patrol is once you get about 3 or 4 years in, they feel that you're bleed green, which means you're true to the agency. And they start telling you all the secrets. That's how I know all the secrets, as I stayed in at least long enough, or a lot of the secrets. And they actively saw, especially after 9/11, they actually sought out us bleed green agents. And I probably would have been offered a position as well, like a lot of my classmates in OIG. So like I had two of my classmates, Armando Gonzalez, who was running the illegal critical incident teams here in San Diego, and his best friend his whole life, Juan Davila, also my classmate, was the OIG inspector here in San Diego. So as he's giving him the bad information, Juan is putting together an OIG report that reflects what the agency wants everybody to see. And so the inspectors tend to be, at least on the Border Patrol side, pretty nefarious and pretty bleed green. Is that what you also see in ICE?
Yeah. My experience, that's been my personal experience. We get a lot less access to names
Yeah.
because we're not insiders like you were. But just a couple of examples. There was an ICE agent who didn't like the fact that a university professor was requesting information about 287G agreements in her county, and that
Hmm.
ICE agent pretended to be a parent of a student at her university and wrote a letter to the president of the university and the governor of the state complaining about this Antifa insurrectionist who's calling for the death of ICE agents. And OPR opened an investigation about this. Thankfully, her university did not fire her or take disciplinary action, but OPR opened an investigation of this. He was later sued as part of the Bean Station raid, which was one of the largest workplace raids in the Trump administration. It was in East Tennessee, and they arrested like 100
Hmm.
people and took them to a National Guard facility. It was like supposed to be an IRS audit, but it got very violent. There's video of people putting their foot on people's necks.
Mm.
He testified in his deposition, "Oh yeah, I've done that. That was me." And the OPR guy was sitting in the deposition, I understand,
Yeah, they
listening to
sit
him
in deposition.
testify.
Yeah.
But the OPR investigation found the complaint unsubstantiated or unfounded. And so that's one. Another one was when the ICE guys that Elliot Osment was suing in Nashville went to one of his former clients' houses, and his wife, who had petitioned for him, they basically falsely imprisoned her in her home. U.S. citizen woman falsely imprisoned her in her home and said they were going to send her husband home either with his permission or in a body bag.
Hmm.
Said
Hmm.
that their lawyer had turned them in to ICE. This is a
Hmm.
means of like attacking a person's ability to make a living. My old boss,
Right.
right? So the OPR investigate. So obviously he complains to OPR, and they do an investigation, and everybody agrees that the investigation happened. They said, "Oh yeah, we found that they were there, and they did the all the things, but the allegations were unsubstantiated," which is another word for, I've learned, and in my opinion, I'm not
I know where
slander.
you're going.
It's another word for they didn't admit to it, you know?
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Like that's what it means. And then, there's a third one where there's a woman in Florida who was detained in Baker County, and she was being sexually assaulted and raped by a guard. She says during her immigration hearing, "I'm being raped by a guard. I'm scared to be at the facility." She's
Hmm.
retaliated against. She sued the prison and ICE, and OPR, according to the sheriff himself, OPR and the U.S. attorney declined prosecution and recommended against prosecution after an investigation.
Hmm.
What they didn't realize is this woman had found a way to surfeit some of the semen that he deposited as he was raping her and send it out of the facility to a third party. And that DNA from that semen is what resulted in his conviction. And he's being
That's the
sentenced.
only way you can do it. You have to be very proactive as a victim.
And and you think about the OPR investigation. It's like how did you decide not to prosecute that and to find it unsubstantiated? You know,
Well, I'll tell
so
you one of the reasons, if people don't know, you probably know this because you're an expert in all this. If it's done the same way in the Border Patrol, what they do is like, even if you get the person's name wrong, if you get the date wrong that it happened, the facility wrong, and in a lot of instances, the people who are in custody don't know where they are
no,
because they get driven all over the place. And there's no signs in these facilities. They're in blacked out buses, and then they come to a sally port, which is like a offloading ramp that goes into the building. They don't have any signage. They have no idea where they are. And they just, they will unsubstantiate absolutely anything for any reason. And so we see that in the Border Patrol. Do you think that's what's also going on over there, is just little nickel and diming things?
that has been my experience.
Okay.
And my experience has been that even if it's caught on camera,
Mm-hmm.
it can sometimes be unsubstantiated, particularly with uses
Mm-hmm.
of force. If you say that, oh no, there was this factor, like a look in his eyes or something like that, like he was about to attack me, then that can be enough to make it so that it's not substantiated. That's one of the appeals to me about doing document-based investigations into deaths in custody, because deaths in custody, unlike a lot of the allegations of abuse in custody, deaths in custody are kind of the ultimate unannounced audit. Whatever
Mm-hmm.
you were doing on that day or in the period leading up to that person's death is what you were doing. And if you
Mm-hmm.
don't have the documentation to show that you were doing the right thing, then you weren't doing the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that
Mm-hmm.
is how, in my view, these investigations work. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, they're taught, if you don't write a report on it, it didn't happen. They're taught, like, if
Yep.
you don't document
Yep.
it, it didn't happen. Um, and they're held notionally accountable to the contracts that require them to do this stuff. And so if you go in and just look, we found in Efrain Romero de la Rosa's case, who died 15 months or 16 months after Gene. He died in July, so 14 months after Gene, at Stewart, almost the same case, except that he had been transported because of his schizophrenia to a mental health facility. because he was so suicidal and acutely decompensating. So when he gets back to Stewart, he gets put back in solitary confinement. He tells a guard on the day he dies he's gonna take his life, stops taking his medication. He tells him he's gonna die 3 deaths and rise again and all this other stuff. And what the video found that Corsovic tried to hide, but what the video found is like multiple times when the checks weren't happening, multiple
Yeah.
times the logs were being falsified. Similar in Ben Owen's death in Baker, same place where this woman was raped. One of the reasons that they could rape her in that facility is because the guards admitted in the death investigation that they had been trained to falsify the RFID tap
Mm-hmm.
shows when you go inside the pod to do your visual
Mm-hmm.
checks. And the
Mm-hmm.
investigation found that he hadn't been checked for like 17 hours visually inspected before he died, which is not what they're guaranteed. Um, and so in situations like that, you have uh, this documentary reality that it's not a he said she said. You can't attack the credibility of the person who died. You know,
Right.
you can just look at what happened, and you're
Mm-hmm.
supposed to because human life is supposed to be valuable, and we're supposed to want to prevent death, right? And we're supposed to learn from
Mm-hmm.
it to prevent it from happening in the future. And yet, when we find these these records, this
Mm-hmm.
evidence, nothing happens. I just asked for records of the rape at Baker from a bunch of agencies, and I was told I was told that uh, they could not provide the records to me by one agency because there's an open investigation. The rape
Yep.
was in 2019, and the guard's been convicted. What? And the sheriff said that the U.S. attorney
Well, we're
declined to
still investigating if he violated our policy, is what they'll say.
I mean, what is the what is the nature of the open investigation, right? And like,
It's to make you
if that,
forget about it.
yeah, no, that's right. That's absolutely right. And that when you see the reflexive answer to this evidence that some lawmakers and people in the system will have, it's like we demand an investigation,
Mm-hmm.
which begs the by whom? Who do
Mm-hmm.
you want to investigate? The same guys that let this happen like before, you know, like
Mm-hmm.
yeah. So in these ways, um, I find there to be a lot of parallels between the critical incident teams and the death review processes that happen in the wakes of in custody deaths.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and I think that that's part of the reason why there's such impunity when there are documented harms, and I think that's part of the reason why um, the violence continues because that's the way it's set up to be.
It's just interesting that, I was thinking back about during the Trump administration and all the children that died in custody, and one of the kids was Carlos. I think he was like 14 to 16 years old. I want to say his last name was Hernandez, one of his last names, and he was sick. The nurses had told the Border Patrol agents he needs to go to the hospital somewhere in Texas, maybe Eagle Pass, and he ends up laying on the floor for over 4 hours right at the toilet because that's where he passed out in this filthy cell. And he's dead for 4 hours, laying and the person who finds him is the other guy, other juvenile who's sleeping in the same cell. They didn't do any of the checks, any of that other stuff. I have a FOIA where we have the critical incident team on the scene in there. And they said, oh no, we didn't do anything, but they took pictures and stuff. And then the 4 hours of the video where he's dead and they should be checking on him magically erased. It just magically erased. And then you never hear anything about the magically erased video. And then they just go on to find that everything was fine
Yeah,
and there's nothing to see here. And then, even with like the stuff I've done on the rape culture. So the critical incident teams garnered, I think, over 10 congressional committees wanted hearings. Went nowhere. Nobody's held a hearing, nothing. And I understand that Republicans have gained control of the House and this and that. But quite frankly, I just don't give a shit. I'm sorry if 10 committees say over 10 committees say this needs to be investigated and then they just don't do it and then hide the teams. And then on the rape culture, we've had Benny Thompson and other people saying we need to investigate this. and nothing is ever investigated. I mean, even like Aaron Siegel McIntyre's proven that they have been raping female agents in the academy since the very first female agents in 1975. Not a word. Not a word. And I think this is that's the scariest part, is kind of like I'm used to seeing the cover-ups at the Border Patrol level, in the stations, at the sector level. And I was fortunate in that I never saw a death cover-up. And I was fortunate in that when I did apply for the critical incident team, I still have the memo. They did not pick me because they knew I was a do-gooder and a whistleblower, so I didn't get picked for that. But it just, they just don't respond. And Congress is, I guess, busy doing other things, and nobody cares. And everybody's like, I just don't understand why they keep getting away with stuff. I mean, Pogo has done a giant piece on lack of accountability and OIG and everything. And it's just, I have come to the conclusion that these law enforcement agencies, at least federally, I think a large part of it, when I was doing the research on the critical incident teams, I was hopeful that like DOJ's civil rights division maybe didn't know about it and stuff, and we could get them in. And then I found a report from DOJ civil rights on why they, I believe it was the Ramses Torres case, where they shot him while he was in Mexico, a young juvenile, and killed him. And they said in that case that according to the Border Patrol Critical Incident Team information, which by the way is not an investigative agency, they just investigate whether Border Patrol agents violate policy. That's not true. They are the cover-up team. They get rid of the evidence. They mess with the evidence so that even if it does get to trial, like in the Jose Antonio Elena Rodriguez case, the jury cannot convict that agent because it's contaminated. They do it all the time. It's done on purpose. And there at the bottom of this memo of the Ramsey Torres thing is this explanation of what the critical incident teams are and how they're not violating the fact that they don't have any authority to be doing these investigations. And so they're in on it. They're in on it, Andrew. And then I've even watched in court where a judge is like, but do Border Patrol agents have the right to be forensics evidence technicians and gather this stuff? And you have the prosecutor saying, well, yeah, because he's U.S. prosecutor, he's like, well, yeah, they've been trained and everything. They've been, sir, have you not been trained? Yeah, I've been trained at the Border Patrol Academy and how to collect evidence and all this. But you still don't have the authority. And ultimately they allow these people to testify, and they say things like, well, you can tell if somebody's carrying drugs on their back by how deep their feet are impressed in the mud when they walk. I'm like, that is just bullshit. You cannot tell if they're 60 pounds heavier because they're fat or if they're carrying 60 pounds of fentanyl on their back. That's just ridiculous. But they take testimony like that, and then they get away with it. And so at all these levels, you just see like there's little ways in that the judges assist that this goes on, and you cannot tell me the judges don't know about this. They don't. Everything is heavily skewed towards protecting the agents at all costs and at all levels. Do you see that as well at ICE?
So yeah, I have three. The short answer is yes, but I have three more specific responses and thoughts that came up while you were talking. You talked about the POGO, Project on Government Oversight Bad Watchdog podcast, which I would recommend to anyone who cares about oversight of DHS. But they describe James Kafari's shenanigans, and particularly with the records of the coup attempt and the destruction of messages. And I found that to be very interesting because on July 15th, 2020, Kufari testified to a House subcommittee regarding where they were revealing that OIG's investigations into the deaths of two children in CBP custody had reached medical conclusions that were unsupported by independent experts, both the I think chief pathologist or chief forensic officer for the District of Columbia and then a Harvard treatment provider had said that these two children died not just from being sick, but from lacking care, and from delayed care. And I remember distinctly during that hearing, Kafari testifying that they didn't get the text messages of the agents involved, didn't even request them, because their testimony was otherwise credible. And I thought, wow, that'd be a really nice thing in an investigation to be able to do. If I can give you enough information that's unverified by texts, and then you're gonna and then you mentioned the Eagle Pass Border Patrol sector, or that port of entry. We're currently in a FOIA case right now where one of the guy's phones is missing. The assistant port director and the port director and others in Eagle Pass were communicating with this guy on the Mexican side, arranging for the presentation of asylum seekers to arrive there. And they
Mhm.
deleted all the WhatsApp messages. They can't explain why they can't just reload WhatsApp onto their phones with the same numbers and recover them like I did when I switched my phone. And then one of the
Mhm.
phones, and they're just refusing to put the guy under oath. They also they failed to tell the National Archives and Records Administration the phone is missing. And so
Mhm.
the DOJ is telling us in that FOIA case, we don't have to do anything else. It's like, no, you're currently helping them continue the crime
Right.
of illegally destroying federal records and then not telling people about it. You do have to do something. And so the National Archives and Records Administration declined to get involved. And they said the judge is going to handle it. And so the judge will. There's a hearing coming up. So that was the first thing, is just like in the Border Patrol context with OIG, the investigation and the congressional hearing resulted in the OIG saying, oh, we didn't seek their text messages because their testimony was otherwise credible. It's like, what good did that do? In the ICE context, I did have this theory that DOJ civil rights and getting them involved, getting somebody outside the DHS ecosphere
Mhm.
or ecosystem would be beneficial because, frankly, I have helped prosecute multiple law enforcement agents who victimized immigrants,
Mhm.
and other people who are in prisons and jails. Worked with a guy who John Lewis's office helped get a federal prison guard convicted, and DOJ civil
Mhm.
rights helped because they lied on the forms and so like it's not unreasonable to me to expect that civil rights would do stuff. But at Irwin, OIG, the US Attorney's Office, and DOJ civil rights, maybe a guy from FBI, did interviews with folks that were unrecorded and untranslated.
Oh my god.
And then one of these women was deported that night.
Mhm. We do that in the Border Patrol too.
So this idea that like bringing in DOJ civil rights or bringing in OIG, like I do think there are good people who want to do the right thing, but systems wise, it's a very difficult thing. And then Irwin, you have the most definitive bipartisan congressional findings about what happened there. 94%
Right.
of invasive gynecologic procedures were conducted on this one population where only 4% of the women were detained. And they couldn't, adequately document consent or necessity, medical necessity for these procedures, which is, the equivalent of battery in some scenarios. And
Mhm.
Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, led by Senator Ossoff, ranking member from Wisconsin, who concurs in the findings. They make all these findings. Kafari's there. Uh, Stuart Smith from IHSC is there, and nothing happens. LaSalle isn't debarred as a contractor. They keep their
Mhm.
contracts, and nothing happens. And so then to ask you specifically, or to answer like the third piece specifically about ICE and the sort of like who's doing these things,
Mhm.
IHSC has its own mortality review. That's the ICE Health Services Corps. They're
Mhm.
actually within organizationally, they're within the Enforcement and Removal Operations Division of ICE, which like we can talk about
Okay.
organizationally, whether that makes sense, but they do a mortality review.
Mhm.
And it includes some people who are commissioned officers of the Public Health Service, which
Mhm.
organizationally is within HHS, but they're detailed to ICE. And what that means, like practically speaking, is those people can go to work for Coast Guard, they can go to work at Border Patrol stations, they can go to work at Bureau of Prisons. They're kind of like the federal government's roving health officers, and they're the only people who wear like military looking uniforms in ICE detention facilities. And so
Okay.
those IHSC mortality reviews, they're a little bit more like beholden to some sort of like reputational pride or scientific, guardrails than anything else. The ERAU, the External Reviews and Analysis Unit, which does the death reviews within ICE OPR, the Office of Professional Responsibility, which we're analogizing to this critical incident team, they don't
Mhm.
even do their own investigating alone. They hire a company called Creative Corrections, which is run by a former BOP warden, guy in Texas. And Creative Corrections, in addition to doing these death reviews and having their experts, who are very often former systems affiliated people, they go in and do interviews, and they've got their healthcare and security compliance analysis that they put together. And then ICE will like pick and choose, ERAL will pick and choose which of those things they want to put in the death review.
Mm-hmm.
Creative Corrections, in addition to doing that, is also doing a lot of the other audits and inspections, like PREA inspections. And so if
Mm-hmm.
you've gone 6 months before and you've blessed a facility as being completely in line with standards,
Mm-hmm.
and that's what you're being contracted and paid to do, are you really incentivized to come in the death case and say, oh no, these people are serially falsifying logs, they're serially failing to check people in
Right.
solitary, there's a drug problem in the facility, there's people getting, access to psychotropic, like, no, you're not incentivized to do that because it means you've, fouled up your previous inspection.
Right.
And so it's like,
Yeah.
why would you trust the people who have a financial incentive to kind of not reveal systemic
Mm-hmm.
problems,
Mm-hmm.
to
Mm-hmm.
say whether in that instance there's a death? And then there was congressional movement to have the OIG, James Kafari, or Joseph Kafari, do a systems level analysis of deaths in custody.
Mm-hmm.
And in his systems level analysis of deaths in custody for like fiscal 2022 or fiscal 21, I forget, he doesn't look at any of the histories of deaths. He just looks at that 1 year. So it's like, and at that one facility, and they only look at the care that is delivered by the providers in the facility. They don't look one step up to see about staffing or
Mm-hmm.
policies. They don't look about like places they were transferred out of or into. And it's a system that is designed. So when you say there's no response to these investigations, I say the no response is the response. When you
Right. Yeah.
demonstrate something horrible has
Mm-hmm.
happened, it's, to me, it's just everybody admitting, oh yeah, something horrible happened. We're not gonna do shit
Mm-hmm.
about it. Like
Mm-hmm.
we're not going to finish the sentence, which is, in I think the most recent example that I wrote about on the Substack was at Torrance, where the Department of Homeland Security's Office of Inspector General told ICE, told Tay Johnson, then acting director and previous head of custody management, told him immediately remove everybody from Torrance. We did an
Mm-hmm.
unannounced inspection. It's not suitable. People
Mm-hmm.
people are at risk. This is very similar to, but an escalation over what OIG found in the run up to Gene's death. That's Stewart. In the run up to Gene's death, OIG investigators who were there talked to people at the facility who told them that understaffing there was a ticking bomb. I mean,
Mm.
that doesn't show up in Gene's death report anywhere, but we know that
Right.
OIG. So OIG tells them take people out of this facility, and ICE refuses to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And then Kesley Vial dies by suicide. And then OIG comes out with another big report that says these problems are unremedied. So ICE temporarily halts transfers into the facility. It's the first time
Okay.
that I'm aware that that's happened. That's like a real consequence. That's maybe 2 years into the Biden administration. It's like, okay, maybe
Mm-hmm.
they're learning. Um, and then in December, this is the only other, I said there's this other ICE detainee death review that's been posted since February of 2017, since Roger Racin's death, and it's Kesley's. And it's an OPR death
Okay.
review that they like two kind of minor things wrong, but they basically find that, he killed himself, like not our fault, not our problem, not Core Civic's problem, had nothing to do with all the stuff OIG was talking about staffing and mental health care and all that. He just did it. And so then they began repopulating the facility from like 4 people in ICE custody at Torrance in
Mm-hmm.
December 2022 to I think they're like 240 something now. And then what ACLU wrote to the director this week about before the vote in Torrance was that actually that OPR detainee death review, ERAL, the people who put that together, that was really incomplete and misleading.
Mm-hmm.
That ICE misled the public in that sort of justification for reopening and repopulating the facility. The ICE Health Services Corps mortality review concluded that Kesley's care was not within the safe limits of practice, which is their way of saying he did not get the care that he needed.
Mhm.
And unlike in a lot of the mortality reviews that we have, they don't actually make a finding about whether the lack of safety in the provision of care contributed to directly or indirectly the death. They used to, but they don't anymore. But I mean, you can look at the report and you can read it and you can see because ACLU got it through FOIA, not because ICE published it. You know,
Right.
you can see that that detainee death review was exculpatory and it was meant to exculpate the system and
Mhm.
allow ICE to keep detaining people there.
Mhm.
And there's not going to be a consequence for that. Nobody's
Mhm.
going to do anything as a result
Mhm.
of that. I
Mhm.
mean, I would love to be proven wrong. Prove me wrong. I mean, truly, go ahead and show me the consequence. But you know, we've documented only 3 times in which financial penalties have been levied against contractors because of death. Two at Stewart and one at Aurora, which Geo owns and runs. In the Kamyar Samimi death at Aurora, it's like a 20% fine from one monthly invoice. And at Stewart, it was like something very similar. So like if you're getting a couple $1 million a month from the federal government and you're fined one-time penalty of 20% for
Mhm.
violating all these rules, but your inspection passes, you don't
Mhm.
have any like, limitation on who you can like, is that really it's kind of I mean, it's like
Right now is like I'm in a point where I recognize obviously it's not the individual agents in the field and this and that. Not to say that they don't commit crimes, but the general concept and I heard you say in your last piece that it doesn't help to belittle and target the individual agents and stuff. And that's why when you do say like Border Patrol or ICE is doing this, then they turn around and say my agents are the most honorable and this and that. Nobody's talking about your stupid agents. What we're talking about is the systems that you've set up and the systems that you have your agents using so that you can cover up and keep doing this kind of stuff. And that's where I eventually get to, and then you see the Border Patrol and even ICE just flagrantly, they're just even more like, yeah, we're just not going to do anything. We don't care about it. I'm thinking of Raymond Mattia, Tohono O'odham, Native man who was shot by Border Patrol, 10 Border Patrol agents present, only 3 shots. So 70% of the agents thought it was a bad shoot and didn't shoot. 30% thought it was a good shoot and they shot. They have it on video. He had nothing in his hand but a cell phone. He wasn't pointing it at anybody and they killed that man. And they decided within, less than 6 months that they were good and told the family, this isn't a fishing expedition for you to sue us and this kind of stuff. And so that happens real fast. And yet you turn around and you look at CBP OPR, who's been investigating the fake river crossings that the Border Patrol Union was doing with right wing media in Texas, in McAllen, Texas, over 3 years ago. And they're still working on that case because they don't have an easy out. And we've proven that they did all this stuff. And so it's going to take them longer than it took, them to investigate Russian collusion. I mean, it's just insane. I've seen investigations last 6 years when you can tell when they feel they're really caught, they take a long time. They take a long time to get anything out. When they think that they've got enough to get away with it, boom, they'll turn around the decision real quickly. And it's just these systems and the fact that congressional members will demand investigations and they're not getting cooperation from these agencies. I really feel like my overall impression, quite frankly, is that DHS itself, DHS and the fusion centers they have across the United States and the joint task force groups that they have, they they are a rogue department in my mind. They are violating people's civil rights. They don't care about it. And they have all these systems set up in place to help them get away with these things. And then when you go to the court, they have all this immunity and stuff, then they get away with stuff. And so at every level, they are protected. And the reason why they are protected is because DHS is protecting the politicians and the people in power from the average everyday people. That's how I feel about it. What's your overall impression? Where are you at right now?
Well, I had a lot of cognitive dissonance about these phenomena, right? Like, so you'll demonstrate to people that you think are acting in good faith by any legitimate, reasonable standard that what people are claiming happened, and then
Mhm.
nothing really comes of it. And that's when, so one of the things I really appreciate about your work is that, I think you serve, and the perspective that you bring and the knowledge that you bring, the expertise that you bring serves as kind of a bridge from people
Mhm.
who came disaffected with the concept of the wall under Trump and the concept of like global birth apartheid. And this is the part where, I mean, you asked me what I think, so I'll give you my political analysis that has helped me resolve the contradictions in my own head and my own cognitive dissonance, and then also clarify like how I move and what I understand about the system, which I fully acknowledge was different when I started. Like the system
Mhm.
taught me how to treat it and how to understand it in ways that I wasn't prepared for. Because when I went to law school, it's like, oh, well, there are these mechanisms by which you fix these things, by which you can reform these
Mhm.
things. I spent so much time delegitimizing and derailing organizers and people by saying, "Oh no, no, we got this person,
Mhm.
this 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 new office or this mechanism or whatever."
Mhm.
And I was really like, I was the person who was doing harm in that way by
Mhm.
quibbling with what the analysis that I've reached, which is that, these are the purpose of a system is what it does, not what it says it does. And this system exacts violence on people, mostly non-white people, who are kind of at the business, mostly non-rich people, so working people,
Mhm.
you see when like rich people get caught up in it, they have lawyers and it goes away, very often. And that is a reflection of its purpose, which is to enforce these sort of like legacy artifacts, and present day living, uh, genocidal and white supremacist and anti-black systems. And
Mhm.
without those structures, without the largest federal police force, larger than all the other federal police forces, like if you look at our budget, the border and immigration is the biggest problem from a budgetary standpoint, you know. And then you see Bortak like in the streets fighting black people and snatching people in vans when they're protesting police violence. Why is that, right? Why do we have all this sort of police domestic surveillance? Where if you're $1 billion corporation, you can be part of the council as part of this public-private partnership. So, like to me, the place where I've gotten, because as a person who matriculated to a big fancy private elite school from a state school, Kennesaw State University, where I was like, had a lot of intellectual insecurities and all this other stuff. Wanted
Mhm.
to be wanted some sort of credibility in doing the work. I found out two things. Number one, the purpose of doing anything, whatever it is, like you don't have to be an immigration lawyer or a civil rights lawyer or a whistleblower. Like, if you're free, then you owe it to other people to help get them free too, and break down the
Mhm.
systems that I found that very on early on. But second, like we cannot approach the system from the analysis that it gives us unless it lives up to that analysis, and it demands an alternative analysis. So these are heavily militarized, heavily violent, racialized systems of oppression. And I've come to believe that this is just another form of sort of domestic warfare that's an extension of all the warfare we visit upon populations everywhere else. Um, in studying immigration law, one of the reasons that people have so few rights and that you can suspend the Constitution at the border and within, for 2/3 of the US population is because of this plenary power doctrine. Well, the plenary power doctrine is an outgrowth, not of anything in the Constitution, but of colonialism, imperialism, and genocide. Like those are the other places where you get plenary power. You get them in colonies and you get them in dealing with, other nations. You don't get plenary power in the sort of like commitment to constitutionalism. And so it's to me, it's not an exception. And I wish that were different. I do. Like I wish that there were these promises. I wish that they meant something, right?
Mhm.
And again, prove me wrong. Shut down a detention center if it kills a person, or
Mhm.
suspend a contractor, or prevent forced labor in a nice detention facility. You know,
Mhm.
um, but there's no amount of proof And so I guess my last piece on this is like when I'm saying, what do I think that doesn't mean we give up. I don't think
Right.
you've given up, although,
No.
man, do they
I
want
have
us to
my
give up?
days.
Yeah, me too, right? I mean, man, do they want us to give up, right?
Oh,
Like,
yeah.
but if you believe hope is a discipline and the way you like practice hope is by acting, I think that there's a role for people to kind of like step back and let people who are directly impacted by these systems truly narrate them from a sense of like power and amplification. And I also think that it's incumbent upon us, if we have skills that can help corroborate stories, to not just like
Mhm.
tell the story or like tell people how to tell their story. I've heard so many immigration advocates tell people not to say you're treating us like animals because allegedly that makes the listener think, oh, you're an animal. I'm just like, what?
No.
You know,
I
like
don't agree with
they
that.
feel like
Yeah.
they're being treated like animals, and that's something that people should hear and
Mhm.
consider whether that's what you want to hear. You know,
Mhm.
on the other hand, we have the capacity to engage in corroboration and documentation, and get records that people who are locked inside border patrol centers or or detention facilities or in the immigration system. We can help document using our privileges in ways that corroborate and bolster what's
Mhm.
happening. So, like, for me, that's meant like when you said earlier, I guess is the last piece is the fact that I think the system is irredeemable doesn't mean I think people are irredeemable. I think
Mhm.
it's actually opened up for me a lot more empathy and dare I say love for some of the people exacting this violence because they too are violence workers just like we were. You as a
Mhm.
as a border patrol agent, me as an immigration lawyer who's in detention, telling a person, sorry, you can't get out, mandatory detention, like
Mhm.
sorry, it's going to
Mhm.
take you too long to fight your case. And like I'm doing some of the violence there, and
Mhm.
so I think the connection that we have then is like, okay, we're all kind of being harmed by the system, some people way more than others.
Mhm.
But it means we don't demonize. Like we can call things truth and we can identify people who are co-opting and lying, but it means like the world that we want, the one that this stuff doesn't happen, is a world that we're all kind of like responsible for making. And
Mhm.
some people have never thought before about what it means to shut down a detention center or not have militarized border policing. But the reality is that that wasn't always the case.
Mm-mm.
And I believe like if you've never thought of it before, yeah, sure, you are
Mhm.
conditioned to have preconceived notions about what it would mean. But also if you're a person of good faith and like intelligence and like if you're a thinking person, it also means you shouldn't have a strong opinion on it yet. you know? Like you should be susceptible if you've never considered what it would mean to cut a contract because they killed a person, or because their
Mhm.
negligent care led to a person's death. If you've never considered what that would mean, then I'm assuming that you'll come to it with an open mind, you know, as opposed to, oh, this system must exist in the way that it has. So that's where I'm at. And I think that narrative intervention um, is key. That's why I'm working as a journalist. I think telling stories like you're doing and helping people understand, because for years, my lawsuits and the ones we brought with people were an effort to lift up those stories of people. We would write complaints to speak, so that people could read them and report on them and not just as like, plaintiff accuses defendant of thing, like we would
Mhm.
want to put the human imagination into the description of the harm. But journalism allows, and research and writing and doing the book stuff that I'm doing, like and teaching and organizing, like that allows you to get to the injustice,
Mhm.
right? John Hanson and Jacob Lipton talk about injustice in this article that they wrote, talking about injustice, this framework of power plus harm or inequality minus legitimacy equals injustice. So when you combine
Mm.
those three things, you combine power with harm or inequality, and you take out legitimacy, everybody understands like injustice. People can define justice differently. But if we can like map the power and explain as a power analysis why it's so hard to close down a facility. Well, obviously, it's because a facility has a lot of money, a lot of lobbyists, a lot of political clout. And then, those facilities are run 94% is the latest ICE number of the facilities that ICE uses are not federally owned, right? So it's like
Mm.
80% are private contractors. And those private
Wow.
contractors, like those private contractors have all these financial relationships with BlackRock and Vanguard principally that own
Mhm.
everything else, right? So like when
Yeah.
you're talking about why is the rent too high? Why can't I get clean water? Why can't I stop climate change? Like there's a power analysis that comes in that I think narratively it's much more simple for me than like trying to get a court to say, oh, this power is, and then on the harm side, like I think just being in space and listening and stepping back, like doing 80%, 20%, like 80% listening, even though I'm not practicing it
Mhm.
right now because it's a podcast. And making the harms more legible to people through expertise that's not about immigration. So like if you want to treat a person like a person instead of like an animal, then you might ask a doctor what's going to happen to them, as opposed to
Mhm.
like some immigration advocate. And then you bring in doctors and they're like, oh no, this is toxic. This is
Mhm.
this
Mhm.
is harmful to people's mental and physical health. And it
Mhm.
has the chance of reducing lifespans, and so that's like articulating and conveying harm in a way that doesn't just like trauma, like the secondary trauma elements of it. And then, I mean, the part that I have a lot of privilege in because I understand a little bit of this stuff because of legal training and all that is the legitimizing. Like many people will just hear and say, "Oh, well, it's because they're immigrants or it's because this is the way the system works." It's like, no, actually, we can look at the legitimacy of these things and we can question whether they are actually in fact legitimate, and
Mhm.
many times you dig under the surface just a little bit, they're not. And that's the
Mhm.
injustice piece. That's what I'm you asked, what's your take? I mean, that's my take, is we can do narrative interventions and we can do solidarity and organizing like you've been doing, and change can happen
Yeah.
because people don't, like I said, we can't all agree. If you and I were to write it on an envelope and say, what's justice? Our definitions would be similar but different. But
Mhm.
if we were to look, at a child screaming in a detention camp, where we're looking at family separation, or we're looking at a death that has been caused by a state actor without any legitimate, you know what I'm saying? Like, we can agree that's injustice. And as long as
Mhm.
we can agree on
Mhm.
that, then we can like start to break it down, you know? Um, so that's
But
the work.
can we agree on that? Because what you will hear so much from those other people is like, well, you shouldn't have crossed the border illegally in the first place. And it's like, I don't know if that's an education thing, it's a generational thing. I'm like, when did we start thinking that way in this country?
I
I
think
mean,
from the beginning.
I don't recall that lesson.
No, from the beginning, I think like there's this difference between what people are conditioned to believe and what people, if you just ask them in the abstract, I think people are preconditioned to have all these kind of like racialized notions and these notions that are premised on history being this one thing. But then if you like ask them about like human to human, and maybe this is like an optimistic view, but my experience with people is once you break down some of the conditioning, some of the propagandizing, that they can typically see the humanity of another person, particularly the closer we get. You know, um, you think about your Trump loving relatives. Like you don't say that person's not human and they deserve. You know what I'm saying? Like, or you try not to, or at least we should aspire not to.
Try not to. Maybe once a year blow up at them, but yeah, yeah,
But yeah, I
yeah.
mean, so I think there are a lot of people who are heavily conditioned to mistrust or distrust like our faith in humanity, and also to believe that there's nothing we can do.
Hmm.
What's the
Well,
point?
and that's what they've
We
been
can't
told for so long too,
That's right.
quite
And that's
frankly.
a
Yeah.
strategy of demobilization that keeps things the way that they are. But I believe that things can and do change completely. And maybe they won't change in our lifetimes, but at least if we're working toward it, they'll change.
Well, what else have we got to do, right?
Yeah,
So
I mean, it's
we got to
that,
work
or we
for
just
something,
see.
right?
That's right. You can make an analysis about what's going on and do nothing because you're demobilized and demoralized, or you can do something.
Right.
And either way,
Right.
like if it's true that we can't change anything, that's all too powerful for us, and it all just it's going to shit. Well, I was not the one on the ship who was sitting around in my chair or like listening to the band play or eating all of
Hmm.
the you know was trying to get people into life vests and trying to get, you know what I'm saying? Like, this is just a choice.
Right.
It was just a choice you can make. Everybody
Yeah.
can make it, you know?
Yeah. I agree. Well,
Stay
thank you
with
for coming on today. I definitely would like to have you on more and more, because we don't talk a lot about ICE in the news. I think we talk more about Border Patrol, but not enough about ICE and the brutality and how these things happen. And the fact that I think the last time I checked track records from Syracuse, they were up to like 70% of ICE people in ICE custody. Their only crime is an immigration infraction, like overstaying their visa. That's just absurd to take somebody's rights away from them and lock them up for overstaying a visa. I mean, it's financially, it makes no sense, but then also it's just brutal and cruel, and it leaves children abandoned who are American citizens with nobody to take care of them and stuff. So, I mean, there's just so much for us to talk about ICE and how they do things. And so I hope you'll come back and we'll do this again.
I agree. I would like that.